From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones.
In January, I underwent major abdominal surgery in London, and at the time, it was thought that my condition was non-cancerous.
When this video was released by the Princess of Wales, all the gossip, all the complaining about photoshopping, the chatter, seemed to stop for a moment.
The surgery was successful. However, tests after the operation found cancer had been present.
Calmly sitting on a bench, she revealed the news that no one wants to have to reveal about themselves, let alone a 42-year-old mother of 3.
My medical team therefore advised that I should undergo a course of preventative chemotherapy, and I'm now in the early stages of that treatment.
Cancer is often seen as an older person's disease, and it is true you're most likely to get it later in life, but there's recently been new data suggesting the 1 in 2 of us who will get cancer at some point are doing so earlier.
Over the past 2 decades, the number of cases in under 50s in young adults has increased by 24%. And that's the steepest rise of any age group. So it means cancer in under 50s is now rising about twice as quickly as it is in the over 75s.
How can this be the case? Do we even know? The story today. Why are so many young people getting cancer?
I'm Molly Guinness, and I am the executive producer of Times Radio Breakfast.
A question I shouldn't probably be asking, but can I ask what your age is?
I'm 39 now. I was 38 when I was diagnosed in February.
Yes. Have you ever really had problems with your health? Or
No. I've always never got ill, slightly frowned upon people getting colds and things. And I feel like, apart from my rather unhealthy shift patterns, I've lived a pretty healthy life.
Well, explain those shift patterns.
Well, for breakfast, I would get up at 3 and get into a taxi at 3:15, 3 a.m, and be at work just a little before 4, which is surprisingly fun. But maybe it does take a toll. But I'm not blaming my shifts on what happened.
Yes. And were you ever somebody who was aware of symptoms, concerned about things? I mean, I'm slightly prejudging here. I'm quite the hypochondriac, so I always catastrophise. But what about you?
Well, I think if you work in news, you just do. You've seen all the case studies. You've read the Daily Mail every day. You've got a lot of things to Google. You know, as soon as there's a story about any kind of cancer, including prostate cancer, you start Googling the symptoms. And so, I've always been incredibly aware of it. And in January-ish, I think I started getting these kind of cramps in my tummy. And I went to the doctor and I said, I could totally live with these as long as they're not a sign of something sinister.
Cramps in what way? And how are they different to cramps you might have had in the past?
They were like, when you get food poisoning, they were like that. So you sort of get this kind of very sudden kind of cramping pain. And then it passes and you think, oh, I probably imagined it. But after a while, it became quite regular. So then I went to the doctor, like every day. Like quite often I'd notice it was in my 5 a.m. meeting where we were discussing what would go through the programme. But I actually think one of the things that made me go to the doctor was saying it out loud to my husband, because one of them hit me and I went, ooh, and he said, what? And I said, I've been getting these tummy aches. And at that point I thought, I haven't imagined it. I've put down a marker and now it's definitely on my to-do list to go to the doctor. So I went quite quickly and she did a whole raft of blood tests and a stool test. And it was the stool test that came back with inflammation markers and microscopic blood in the stool. So then I was on the kind of fast track to have a colonoscopy.
And at that point, what were you thinking?
When she rang me to say those things, that was a moment. That was my moment of horror. I was like, I've definitely got cancer. And I had about a week before the colonoscopy, or a week and a bit. My husband, luckily, was very positive and cheerful and kept me cheerful. But it meant that when I was in the colonoscopy and they found it, I was probably less shocked than he was.
And they found it whilst they were doing the colonoscopy. Did they say, oh, we've seen this and it is most likely cancer, or what?
Yeah, so you see it as well yourself. It's quite a big screen and I could see this huge thing blocking the colon. And he said, I can't get the camera past this, so I'm going to stop the colonoscopy. We're taking a biopsy. Pretty sure it's cancer. Then I went into the recovery room, drank some special fluid to then go downstairs and have a CT scan so they could look at the rest of my organs, because obviously they'd only been round a bit of the colon, so we didn't know whether there were loads of other tumours behind it or anything. But I was lucky there was only one. It was quite big, but it hadn't got into the lymph nodes.
That all sounded quite businesslike, the way that was told to you and quickly whisked off. Is that how it felt?
Incredibly businesslike. I don't mind if doctors don't have a good bedside manner. I almost prefer it. You always will want to impress your doctor, don't you? Asking intelligent questions. And it was very businesslike. And then went into a quiet room, as they're called, rather sinisterly. And my mother was there and my husband, and they came in. And he'd told us all again, very businesslike. And my mother said, Doctor, have we caught it early? And he said, I can tell you now it's not early. It's big. And then I fainted.
Gosh.
And then he said to me in recovery afterwards, we've asked you to be nil by mouth. We've pumped you full of pretty strong drugs. And now we've just bombarded you with a lot of information. That was a perfectly reasonable response. And I felt enormously pleased by that, by him saying that, which is a bit ridiculous. Like, impressing the doctor wasn't top of the agenda at that point.
Was there a point at which all of that toing and froing stopped and you could actually then talk to your husband and your mum, or?
Well, then we went downstairs, had this scan, and then we finally got out of the hospital and we went to a pub, and my mum was like, let's get you a Guinness so you can mix it with the fentanyl. That's what you need. And we had a nice chat there. I called all my brothers and my dad, and we had a good chat. And because I was so sure I had it before we went into hospital, I'd done a bit of reading, and I was like telling them, the treatments now are so good. It's going to be cured. It's going to be fine. But it wasn't until a couple of days later that I got hold of my CT scan report, and I could see that there was only one tumour. And then I thought, well, I just don't have to be frightened anymore. They got it out very quickly. And now I'm on this, what's called adjuvant, word of the moment, adjuvant chemotherapy, which is basically in case there are any cancer cells circulating, it will kill them off.
So you told all of your brothers and things from the pub with your Guinness and fentanyl and your mum and your husband. Were those difficult conversations?
Yeah, so over the next day or so, I got quite good at telling people calmly and cheerfully. You have to sort of take a bit of a deep breath and not be fake. But yeah, you could hear they were all really upset and shocked. Everyone's reaction is different, but I sort of felt almost like it was my responsibility to not turn it into even more of a drama than it was.
Not to upset them?
Yeah.
Amazing. How old are your two kids?
7 and 8.
How did they receive the news? How did you explain the news to them?
They were absolutely fine. I started getting all these parcels arriving, and they were like, why has somebody sent you this or that? And I was like, okay. And I hadn't quite worked out what I was going to say to them at this point, but I was like, okay, right, this is the situation. I had to go to hospital a couple of days ago. Neither of you asked me anything about it. Well, they did find this sus thing. Sus is their favourite word. As in, like, suspicious.
Oh, yes, because teenagers will sort of, that's a bit sus.
Yeah. So I explained that they'd found this thing in my tummy that needed to get taken out. And they were like, okay, yeah, sure, there's a sus thing. Like, now can we open the chocolates? And then a few days later, my nephew, 3-year-old nephew, came round, and Stanley literally drew him a diagram of what was going on inside me and explained it to him. I'm not sure if he really took it in because he's only 3. But yeah, they were completely fine about it. They weren't allowed to visit me for the first 3 days when I was in hospital because I was in intensive care. But then they came and visited. I think the thing is, like, to not catastrophize it, to be very clear with facts and not have any secrets or an atmosphere of secrecy about it.
Yeah.
I heard them saying to their friends, yeah, Mum is a bit lazy at the moment because she's on this chemotherapy because she's got cancer. But, like, don't be freaked out by those words because she's fine.
and it's amazing, actually, the power of that word cancer, isn't it? I mean, have you found yourself shying away from it or oversaying it to make a point, or?
I haven't used it very much at all, partly because I don't have cancer. I got it out. The operation happened 10 days after the diagnosis. So I officially had it for 10 days. And there is a possibility that there is some in my body that needs to be killed, but I don't think of myself as having cancer now. I think of myself as just recovering from it.
What is happening with your treatment at the moment then? So is the idea that you just have to stay on this, what was the drug called again?
It's called capecitabine.
So you have to stay on that for a while?
Yeah, so I think it finishes in September if everything goes well. So I take 4 pills in the morning and 4 in the evening for 2 weeks, and then I have a week off, and I go and have blood tests, reissue the drugs. So it's 2 weeks on, 1 week off, 8 times.
Yes. And what have doctors said to you about how well it's going?
They're very pleased with my blood tests. You get so obsessed with your blood tests. There are always like bumps in the road, but basically the operation should have cured me. The chemotherapy should still cure me, and they'll keep monitoring me. I remember thinking really early on, well, one thing I can really stop worrying about is getting cancer now, because they're going to be on the case. I'm going to be scanned and blood tested for years to come.
I can remember years ago, I think it might have been a family friend or someone who was in their 60s saying to me, and I must have been quite young at the time, oh, the problem with your 60s is all of a sudden everyone around you, and maybe even you yourself, gets diagnosed with cancer. You just notice it everywhere. Everyone ends up having it. It's interesting that now that's getting earlier and earlier, and there's research that's looked into that, but also even just anecdotally, you're not the only person of your age who I know who's been diagnosed with cancer recently. It seems like it's around.
It does seem like it's around, but also there's kind of bias when you get it. My 3 cancer friends are all my age, but I wasn't in touch with them. They were people I'd lost touch with. Now I'm back in touch with them. They're wonderful people to be in touch with, because they're the only people you can text and be like, come on, the neutrophils, my blood counts.
What are the neutrophils?
They're a type of white blood cell, I guess. That when your blood test, your chemotherapy kind of attacks them, so you want them to kind of stay up. Otherwise, it's important for your immune system. But it's really nice to have them in my life.
I'm Eleanor Hayward. I am health editor at The Times.
And you've just come back from Chicago, where you're attending the world's biggest cancer conference. I mean, how does it label itself?
Yes, it's the American Society of Clinical Oncology, and every year they hold a conference in Chicago for 5 days, and it's got 40,000 attendees. So it pretty much takes over Chicago for a week. All the billboards and everything around the city, they are just advertised with cancer drugs, and there's people from all over the world come, and it's usually where some of the biggest research in cancer is presented.
Yes. I mean, but what is actually inside the conference itself? I mean, is it like the Idle Home exhibition? Are there sort of stands for different drugs and stages where people are doing talks?
Yeah, it's a huge conference centre, and there's hundreds and hundreds of kind of booths, which are often for individual drugs. And in America, the pharmaceutical industry is huge, and they're allowed to advertise everything. There's also lots of separate halls where people are doing presentations on their research, and more than 7,000 studies, I think, were presented this year.
How on earth do you fill it that for news?
You do a lot of Control F and try and find interesting buzzwords in all the studies.
One of the big bits of news out of the conference which you reported on was the increase in cancer diagnoses for people under 50. We always think of cancer being a slightly older person's problem, but more younger people getting it.
Yeah, one of the big talking points of the conference was this increase in people under the age of 50 getting cancer, and that's known as early onset cancer. And we've kind of seen reports coming from around the world of a pattern of increase in early onset cancer. But this is the first time we've had data showing the scale of the problem in the UK.
In the UK specifically?
Yes.
I see. And what did that data actually show?
So the data was from Cancer Research UK, and it looked at national NHS data comparing rates of cancer from the early 1990s to the latest data we have, which goes up to 2019. So that showed that over the past 2 decades, then the number of cases in under 50s and young adults has increased by 24%, which is a really striking increase. And that's the steepest rise of any age group. So it means cancer in under 50s is now rising about twice as quickly as it is in the over 75s.
And yet we should say that still the vast majority of cancer cases are still in people over 50, but it's just that the younger ones are rising.
Yes, so cancer is still predominantly a disease of old age. So only about 1 in 10 cases still are in under 50s, and that's despite this big increase. And if you look at the data, then someone who's in their 70s or 80s is about 15 times more likely to get cancer than someone under the age of 50.
And is this all cancers or just certain types?
The pattern's been seen across all cancers, but the one causing the most concern is bowel cancer. And in the UK and in America and in a lot of other Western countries, and there's real concern about a surge in bowel cancer cases. And that adds to the theory that it might potentially have something to do with the Western diet.
Go on, in what way?
So obviously, these countries have all adopted fairly similar diet patterns in the past 30, 40 years. And one thing scientists are looking at quite closely is if the kind of highly processed diet that we've seen emerge over the past few decades might have something to do with the rise in early onset cancer.
And you've been speaking to somebody who knows quite a lot about this. Explain who he is.
Yes, while I was in Chicago, I interviewed Professor Charles Swanton, who is the chief clinician at Cancer Research UK, and he's been looking into this puzzle of why more young adults are getting cancer.
What did you make of what he had to say?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think most scientists seem to think it's a combination of different factors rather than just one thing that's causing this increase. But really, they have to look back and think, what has changed in the past 20 or 30 years that means people are more likely to get cancer now? Have this younger generation been exposed to something that their parents' generations were not?
The number of advanced cases of colorectal cancer increased in the 50s, and then soon after that, the early onset cases of colorectal cancer increased sort of decade by decade from the sort of 60s, 70s onwards. And so the question has come up from epidemiologists in the field, is there something that was introduced in the sort of post-war period into the diet that has allowed these cancers to initiate earlier and earlier? It could be alterations in the gut microbiome. It could be something in the diet that alters the microbiome, or something in the diet that alters the integrity of the epithelial lining, the skin lining, if you like, of the gut. What could that be? Well, some people have suggested high fructose corn syrup, other dietary factors that are associated with obesity, or even microplastics and pollutants. We just don't know.
Obviously, one of the key factors is obesity, because the big obesity epidemic we've seen in all Western countries really took off in the 1980s, 1990s, and that's when the rise in early onset cancers began to take off as well. So it's likely that is playing a role. But as we just heard, that doesn't really explain by itself why cancers are rising so much.
And as Professor Swanton was sort of hinting at, there are all these so many different things that we know could be contributing to it. It could just be a big mess of all of them together, as opposed to, it is too much beef that's doing it, or what have you.
Yeah, it's a pretty complex picture, and it's likely that everything is coming together in a bit of a perfect storm. But one thing that everyone I've spoken to about this has said is that there's probably an unknown risk factor as well, that we don't really know what it is yet, that's come along and joined things like obesity, smoking, alcohol, and that people are being exposed to, which can increase their risk of cancer. And some of the possibilities for that are new ingredients that are going in diets, maybe something to do with ultra-processing of food, additives, sweeteners, how that might interact with the risk of cancer. There's also things like microplastics and air pollution and the use of antibiotics. That's something that's changed in recent decades as well, which could be partly explaining why we're seeing a surge in cancers.
And so we've got this enormous puzzle. How does someone like Cancer Research UK or anyone try and solve it?
Yeah, it's become a huge focus of research now. A lot of funding is going into trying to solve this puzzle. Cancer Research have provided 20 million in funding to a team at King's College London, and that's led by Professor Tim Spector, who's a very well-known epidemiologist. He's known
of the Zoe app.
Yeah, him of the Zoe app, who does a lot of work on the gut microbiome, and we think that the gut microbiome is playing a role. So the team there are going to investigate links between gut bacteria, diets, and early onset bowel cancer, with the hope of trying to come up with an answer to what it might be that's causing early onset bowel cancer. And then potentially they can come up with advice and say, these are the foods that seem to be linked to early onset bowel cancer. And this is how people could change their diets to reduce their risk.
We've also seen quite a trend of growing public awareness of this kind of thing, haven't we? Especially with some sort of key celebrity cases.
Yes, Dame Deborah James died of early onset bowel cancer when she was 40, so 2 years ago. And she did a huge amount of work on raising awareness of the symptoms of bowel cancer. And the main symptoms of bowel cancer are changes in your bowel habits and blood in your poo.
I have the poo cancer.
The glam cancer.
I have the glam cancer. I'm 36 years old. I was diagnosed just over a year ago after 6 months of a change of bowel habits, basically where I was pooing blood.
Because of this, it used to be a bit of a taboo disease. People wouldn't really talk about it that much, and therefore people wouldn't be aware of the symptoms. And I think we've seen through the work of Dame Deborah James and other people, huge awareness of what the symptoms are. And that means more people are likely to go to their doctor if they spot any of these kind of worrying symptoms.
So could it be the case that part of the rise in early onset diagnosis is because more people are going to get these diagnoses?
Yeah, it could be the case that people are developing cancer at the same time as they were before, but now they're getting it picked up at an earlier stage. So they might go to the GP a few years earlier when the tumour is still small and easily treatable, whereas before it could have spread around the body by the time they get a diagnosis. And with bowel cancer especially, then early diagnosis is really key for survival chances. If your bowel cancer is caught at a very early stage, then about 90% of people will survive for 5 years or more. Whereas if it's caught at stage 4, which is the latest stage when bowel cancer spread around the body, then only about 10% of people survive. So getting people aware of the symptoms so that as soon as they notice something is wrong, they can go to a doctor and have scans and have further tests is really key to improving survival.
Because still it is relatively rare in young people, and you do hear stories of young people having concerns that, oh, maybe it could be bowel cancer, but sometimes being told, don't be ridiculous, you're a 30-year-old woman, you wouldn't have bowel cancer.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's quite a lot of tragic cases been in the news recently where people have just been dismissed by their GP. They've gone to their GP or to doctors and said, I know something's not right. And the doctor might just think, they can't be a cancer patient, they're super fit, they're in their 20s, 30s. And I think there's real awareness needed among the medical profession as well as among patients about the risk of cancer in young people.
So if we're seeing more people under 50 being diagnosed with cancer, specifically things like bowel cancer, it seems, that's obviously awful for the individual involved, but I guess thinking broadly, that's going to have quite the impact on the health service, on society.
Yeah, I think it poses particular challenges for the NHS when you've got a much younger population coming forward with cancer. And one big one is fertility. So if you're a younger patient in your 20s or 30s being diagnosed with cancer, then most of the treatments, if you're having chemotherapy, some types of radiotherapy, will affect your fertility. So that means the NHS needs to be prepared to have things like egg donation and sperm banks ready so that people can preserve their fertility if they're going through cancer treatment.
So if this is all happening, what is the medical profession doing, I guess, to improve treatment and also detection maybe as well?
So one of the ways the NHS is trying to improve detection is through screening programmes, and these are offered for bowel cancer, breast cancer and cervical cancer on the NHS. The bowel cancer screening programme was previously only offered to over 60s. That's now being brought down for everyone in their 50s as well. So if you're over the age of 50, you'll be involved. But there's potentially scope for it to be expanded further, maybe to people in their 40s as well, which is something that I think with this rise in early onset bowel cancer, we might see happening. It's already happened in the US where people over 45 are invited for bowel cancer screening. Another thing the NHS is doing is trying to find people who are at high risk of cancer. And that includes people with genetic mutations that can cause cancer. So Angelina Jolie, she famously has this gene called BRCA, and that led to her having a double mastectomy before she'd got cancer, because people with this particular genetic mutation are very likely to get breast cancer. So the NHS is trying to screen people at an earlier age, offer them genetic tests, and if they do have this mutation, they can then be followed up quite closely so that if they develop cancer, it's picked up very early.
It's a sort of health equivalent of crime prevention, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Like what you see in policing. It's quite bleak news, the idea of more younger people being diagnosed with cancer. But thinking about this conference you went to, there must have been some encouraging things about the leaps and bounds that are happening in treatment, which is getting better and better all the time. What did you see that made you optimistic?
I think the most exciting area from the conference is a new field of medicine, which is basically cancer vaccines. So if you think about vaccines, often we think about it as something that prevents disease.
Yeah.
But cancer vaccines are actually given to people who've already got cancer. So they're given to patients after they've had surgery to remove their tumour, and the aim is to stop the cancer coming back. The vaccines are tailor-made for each individual, so they're based on their own tumour, and they encourage the body to recognise the tumour and the cancer cells as foreign. The idea is that you have surgery to remove your tumour, say you've got a bowel tumour, and then you're injected with a custom-made vaccine that triggers your immune system to recognise the cancer cells and to then go and attack the cancer cells. And so it keeps the cancer at bay. And there's real hope that this can be used for multiple different types of cancer and really provide a new weapon against the disease.
Eleanor Hayward, all of Eleanor's work, including that series of fabulous reports from the World Cancer Conference in Chicago, are at thetimes.co.uk or in print. The producer today was Chris Wade, the executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition was by Myla Seto. The story at thetimes.co.uk is how you can reach us with your experience of this. Maybe you have a comment, let us know. Do review us as well, wherever you're listening to us, kindly, if you wouldn't mind. And you don't need me to tell you this, but if you're concerned about any symptoms like those that we've discussed in this episode, go and see a doctor. One thing we do know is catching these things early makes a hell of a difference. Goodbye.